Some things are better left unsaid until I'm gone. That's what I told my daughter, standing in her kitchen on a Tuesday in March, 3 years before she had my mail redirected without asking me. She thought I was being stubborn. She thought I was hiding something small, some old grudge, some embarrassing secret about money or a woman from before her mother. She had no idea what I actually meant, and by the time she found out, I wasn't there to explain it, and the only voice left to do the explaining was mine, on paper, read out loud by a lawyer in a room she couldn't leave. Welcome to Family Story Archives. Get comfortable. This one is going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. My name is Victor Alderman. I'm 76 years old, and until my knees gave out on the tractor steps 2 winters back, I farmed 640 acres of cotton and sorghum ground off County Road 1,500, 11 miles east of Lubbock, Texas. My father farmed it before me. His father broke it out of raw caliche dirt in 1931. With a team of mules and a plow he bought on credit, he didn't pay off until he was 60. I drive a 1998 Ford F-150, primer gray, on the left rear fender, where I backed into a fence post in 2004 and never got around to painting it. I wear the same 3 flannel shirts, October through March, and the same 2 straw hats, April through September. My wife, Loretta, passed 3 years ago this coming October. Breast cancer, 11 months from diagnosis, to the funeral home on 34th Street. I don't talk about her much because talking about her makes it real in a way that isn't useful to anybody, least of all me. If you asked me what I do, I'd tell you I just work the land, same as always. That's not the whole truth. It's not even close. But that part comes later, and it comes the way most true things about me come out, sideways and late, and only after somebody's already decided they know the whole story. I have 2 children. Denise, 47, married to a commercial developer named Roger Cole, living in a 5-bedroom house off Milwaukee Avenue on the west side of Lubbock. And Thomas, 44, who moved to Denver in 2009 for an oil and gas accounting job and comes back for Christmas most years, sometimes Easter, always with an apology already loaded before he even says hello. Denise has 1 daughter, Emma, 19, in her 2nd year of the nursing program at Texas Tech. Emma is the only one of the 3 of them who still calls me just to talk. No occasion required. I want you to remember that about Emma, because everything I did over the last 2 years of my life, I did with her name written at the top of the page. For a long time, none of this mattered, because for a long time, my family and I got along fine. Not perfect. Denise and I argued about the land the same way every family with land argues about it. What happens to it? Who gets it? Whether it should be sold or kept. Normal friction. Then Loretta died, and something in the friction changed texture. I noticed it first at the funeral reception, in the fellowship hall of First Baptist on 50th Street, when Roger pulled me aside near the coffee urn and asked, gently, like it was a kindness, whether I'd thought about what I was going to do with the house now that it was just me two. That was February of 2023. I want you to hold on to that date, because it matters later. If you've been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. By that April, Denise stopped by on a Sunday with a folder of brochures for a place called Meadowbrook Senior Living out on 82nd Street. Glossy photos of couples playing checkers, A monthly rate printed in small font at the bottom that I did the math on twice because I didn't believe it the first time. I told her I appreciated her thinking of me, and I put the folder in a drawer in the mudroom, under a stack of seed catalogs, where it sat for the rest of that year. By August, the calls started thinning out. Not stopping. Thinning. A Sunday call became every other Sunday. Every other Sunday became once a month, usually short, usually about something practical. Did I take my blood pressure medicine? Had I seen a doctor about the knee? I told myself, people get busy. Roger had a big commercial project breaking ground that fall, a strip development off Slide Road, and Denise was helping him with the financing paperwork most evenings. I believed that, because I wanted to, and because for 47 years she'd never given me a real reason not to. Then came the appraisal. In October of 2023, a land appraiser named Hutch Delaney knocked on my door with a clipboard and told me Roger Cole had requested a valuation of the Alderman acreage for, in his words, estate planning purposes. Nobody had told me that was happening. I let him walk the property because I had nothing to hide and no reason yet to think anyone else did either. 3 weeks later, I found out from Earl Whitfield, not from my own daughter, that the appraisal had come back at $4.1 million, more than double what I'd have guessed, because Lubbock's western growth corridor had crept closer to my fence line than I'd bothered to track. Earl Whitfield has worked this land beside me for 41 years. He's 68 now, drives a 2011 Chevy Silverado with 210,000 miles on it, and he's the closest thing I have left to a brother. Earl heard about the appraisal from Hutch Delaney's own crew, because Earl still does business with half the county, and people talk to him the way they don't talk to me anymore. When he told me, standing in my equipment shed on a Thursday afternoon, with the smell of diesel and cut hay still in the air, he didn't ask me what I was going to do about it. He just said, "Victor, you might want to know some things before somebody else decides them for you." That's Earl. He shows up before you even finish asking. I want to ask you something before we go further, because I've thought about it a lot since. If your own child requests a valuation on everything you own without mentioning it to your face, what does that tell you they're already planning for? And what does it tell you about how much longer they think you'll be around to have an opinion about it? Some things are better left unsaid until I'm gone. I said that line to Denise for the first time that same October, standing in her kitchen on Milwaukee Avenue, after she'd finally asked me straight out whether I'd thought more about Meadowbrook. I said it quiet. I said it the way you say something you've already decided about, not something you're still weighing. She laughed a little, not unkindly, and said, "Dad, you don't have to be so dramatic about it." I let her think that. I let her think I was just an old man being difficult about change, because the alternative was telling her the truth, and I wasn't ready for what telling her the truth might cost either one of us. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 6 weeks before that conversation, I had already been to see a woman named Patricia Delgado, an estate attorney with an office on Broadway Street downtown, 22 years in practice. The same lawyer who'd handled Loretta's affairs when her mother passed. I sat in Patricia's office on a Wednesday morning in early September, and I told her I wanted to restructure everything. Not out of spite. Out of something closer to grief and something closer to fear. Because I had started to notice a pattern in my own family that I recognized from other families, other stories, and I did not intend to become one more version of it. By November, the calls from Denise had nearly stopped altogether. Thomas called twice that fall, both times about football scores, neither time about me. Only Emma kept coming by, usually on a Thursday after her clinical rotations at Covenant Medical Center, still in her scrubs, smelling like hospital soap, sitting across from me at the same kitchen table Loretta used to roll out pie dough on. Thanksgiving that year, 2023, was at Denise's house on Milwaukee Avenue, 14 people around a table built for 10, and somewhere between the turkey and the pie, Roger's brother-in-law, a man named Kurt, who I'd met maybe 4 times in my life, asked me in front of the whole table what I planned to do with, quote, all that land once I couldn't keep up with it anymore. I told him I intended to keep farming it as long as my body let me, same as I always had. Denise laughed, not cruelly exactly, but not kindly either, and said, Dad, be realistic. You're 76. Roger's already talked to 3 different developers about the western section alone. I remember exactly how the room went quiet, and I remember exactly how Emma's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and I remember exactly how Denise didn't take the sentence back, didn't soften it. Just let it sit there on the table next to the pie like she'd said something obvious, instead of something that told me, finally and completely, how far along this had already gotten without my signature on a single piece of paper. Emma is the one who told me, weeks later in December, almost as an afterthought, that her mother had started referring to the farm at other family gatherings as when we sell the place, not if. That was the first time I understood, really understood, that this wasn't drift. This was direction. In January of this year, Roger showed up at my door on a Saturday morning with a folder of his own. Inside it was a durable power of attorney form, already partially filled out, naming Denise as my agent for financial decisions. He told me it was just a precaution, the kind of thing responsible families put in place, no different from a will. He asked me to sign it that day, in front of him, before he even offered to leave the papers so I could read them properly or take them to a lawyer of my own. I want you to sit with that for a second. A man asked me to sign away control of everything I own on the spot, without letting me read it first. I told him I'd think about it. He didn't like that answer. His jaw did the thing jaws do when a man is angry and trying not to show it, and he said, Victor, you're not getting any younger. Somebody needs to be able to make decisions if something happens to you. I told him something already had happened to me. Loretta died. I was still standing. I could still make my own decisions just fine, thank you. He left without the signed form. He also left without saying goodbye the way he used to, with a handshake and a joke about the Cowboys. That silence told me more than anything he'd said. I called Patricia Delgado that same afternoon. She didn't ask me why I was calling on a weekend. She just asked me what happened, and then she asked me one more question that changed the shape of everything that came after. Victor, has anyone had you evaluated by a doctor recently, for any reason at all? Nobody had, which was exactly the point, because 6 days later, I found out from Emma, calling me in tears from the parking lot of her dorm, that her mother had scheduled what she called a wellness check with a new physician. Neither of us had ever met. A doctor with an office out past the loop who did not know me, had never treated me, and who Denise had specifically requested review my, quote, capacity for independent decision-making. Thomas called that same week, the first time in almost 2 months, and I let myself hope for a minute that he was calling because Emma had told him what was happening. He wasn't. He was calling because Denise had asked him to talk some sense into me about signing the power of attorney, framing it to him as simple paperwork their father was being stubborn about for no good reason. I asked Thomas straight out, whether he'd read the actual document himself before agreeing to make that call. He hadn't. He admitted it, quiet, a little embarrassed, and for a second I thought maybe there was something left to work with in him. Then he said the thing that told me exactly how far this had already gone without me. He said, "Dad, it's probably easier for everybody if you just sign it." Not because he believed I was incapable, because it was easier. That's a different kind of betrayal than Denise and Roger's. Quieter, lazier, but it cuts the same depth in the end, maybe deeper, because it comes dressed as indifference instead of ambition. I hung up that call and sat on my back porch for a long while, looking out at 640 acres. My grandfather broke out of raw ground with a mule team, thinking about how 3 different people, in 3 different ways, had all arrived at the same conclusion that year. That I was a problem to be managed instead of a man to be asked. If you've watched enough of these stories, you already know where that road usually leads. A quiet evaluation. A diagnosis stretched further than it should go. A judge somewhere down the line signing a guardianship order because nobody in that courtroom knew the man well enough to argue otherwise. I knew that road too. I'd read about it. I wasn't going to walk down it blind. Some things are better left unsaid until I'm gone. I said it again that week, to Earl this time, sitting on the tailgate of his Silverado at dusk, and Earl finally asked me straight out what I meant by it. I told him, all of it. And Earl, 68 years old, 210,000 miles on his truck, said the thing I will remember for the rest of however many years I have left. He said, "Victor, whatever you need, I've got the ranch. Sell it if you have to. I'll figure out the rest." He offered to mortgage 40 acres of his own land his father left him, to help me cover whatever legal costs came next. I told him it wouldn't come to that. I hoped it wouldn't come to that. I didn't know yet how far Denise and Roger were willing to go. Earl didn't stop at the offer. 2 weeks later, he drove into Patricia Delgado's office on Broadway Street on his own, without telling me first, and put down a signed statement, notarized, describing every conversation he'd overheard or been told about regarding the appraisal, the power of attorney, and the doctor's appointment scheduled behind my back. He didn't have to do that. Nobody asked him to. He told Patricia, and later told me, that if this ever ended up in front of a judge, he wanted there to be somebody in the record who'd known me 41 years and could say, under oath, exactly what kind of man I was and exactly what kind of pressure had been building around me. Patricia told me it was the single most useful piece of paper in the entire file, more useful than the appraisal, more useful than the power of attorney form itself, because it established a pattern, a timeline, not one bad moment, but a sequence. That same week, I asked Patricia a question that had been sitting in my chest for a month. I asked her how often this actually happened, families doing this to a parent still living and still capable. She didn't sugarcoat it. She told me her firm handled at least 6 or 7 cases a year that looked close to identical to mine. Different names, different acreage, same shape entirely. An appraisal nobody asked for. A doctor nobody chose. A form nobody was given time to read. She told me about a client from 2 years earlier, a widow out past Idalou, whose own son had gotten a judge to sign a temporary guardianship order over a 6-week gap, where nobody checked whether the medical evaluation behind it had even been conducted by a licensed geriatric specialist. It hadn't. It took 8 months and $11,000 in legal fees to undo. I sat with that number for a long time after I left her office that day. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Family Story Archives. Now let's get back to it. In February, I went to see Dr. Samuel Okafor, my physician of 19 years at Covenant Medical Group, and I asked him, plainly, to run every cognitive assessment he had available and to put the full results in writing, dated, signed, notarized, if it would hold up better that way. He looked at me for a long moment before he asked why. I told him about the new doctor Denise had scheduled behind my back. Dr. Okafor's face changed. He'd known me since Loretta's diagnosis. He knew what a real decline looked like, because he'd watched me through the year I lost her, through the exhaustion and the grief fog that comes with that. And he told me flatly that nothing about me now resembled anything close to incapacity. He wrote it all down. Full mental status exam, normal. Full neurological screening, normal. A Montreal Cognitive Assessment score of 29 out of 30, missed only on a delayed recall item. Most healthy 76-year-olds missed too. A letter on letterhead, dated February 14th, stating in plain language that I retained complete capacity to manage my own affairs, my finances, and any decisions regarding my property. I remember sitting in the exam room on 4th Street that afternoon, the paper crinkling under me on the table, watching Dr. Okafor write in a chart he'd kept on me since 2005. The year I came in about a persistent cough that turned out to be nothing, and thinking about how strange it was that the same office where he'd once told me Loretta's scan results looked clean was now the office proving, on paper, that I was still fully myself. He asked me, near the end of the appointment, off the record, whether I was doing all right, really, underneath all this. I told him I didn't know yet. He didn't push further. He just signed the letter, notarized it himself through his office manager, and told me to keep a copy somewhere nobody but me could reach. I kept that letter in a fireproof box in Patricia's office, not my own house, because by then I no longer trusted what might happen to paperwork left in my own home while I was out in the fields. That same month, Patricia and I finished the real work, the work I'd started back in September and had been quietly building ever since. We didn't rewrite my will into something dramatic or vindictive. We built a trust, an irrevocable trust, funded with the majority of the land and the mineral rights beneath it, with Emma Cole named as the primary beneficiary, her access structured to release in stages, at 25, at 30, and fully at 35, with an independent trustee, not a family member, overseeing distributions until then. Patricia's firm would serve as trustee. Denise would receive a modest cash inheritance, enough to be fair, not enough to be the $4.1 million windfall she and Roger had apparently already started planning around. Thomas would receive the same. Neither of them would have any authority over Emma's trust, and neither of them would find out any of this existed until after I was gone, because I had learned by then exactly what people do with information about money while the person who earned it is still alive to be pressured. Patricia structured the independent trustee provision so that Emma would never have to ask a family member for anything. Not tuition, not a car repair, not a down payment on some future apartment, not without the trustee's sign-off. And even that sign-off was written broad enough that Patricia's firm could approve reasonable requests without Emma needing to justify herself to anyone who'd ever made her feel small for asking. We built in a discretionary education and healthcare clause, specifically so nursing school, and whatever came after it, would never again depend on whether her mother was in a generous mood that month. I remember asking Patricia to read that clause back to me twice, out loud, in her office on Broadway Street, just to be sure the language couldn't be twisted later by a lawyer smarter than either of us. She read it twice. It held. I know how that sounds. I want to be honest about it. This wasn't some triumphant secret plan I felt good about executing. I hated every step of it. I hated sitting across from Patricia signing documents that would only matter after my own funeral, thinking about my daughter finding out this way instead of hearing it from me face to face while I could still explain my reasons and let her be angry at me directly instead of at a piece of paper. I thought about undoing it more than once. What stopped me every time was Emma's face the last time she sat in my kitchen and told me her mother had started talking about the farm like it was already sold, already spent, already somebody else's future instead of hers. By March, Roger tried one more time, this time with a different lawyer of his own present, pushing a version of the same power of attorney form, softer language this time, framed around helping me, framed around love. I told them both, calmly, the same thing I'd told Roger in January. I could still make my own decisions. I had a doctor's letter proving it. And if they kept pushing, I told them, I would start wondering out loud, to people in this county who still remembered my father and my grandfather, exactly why my own daughter needed so badly for a judge to declare me incompetent before I'd even had the chance to say no for myself. For about 3 weeks after that March meeting, I let them believe they'd won something. I stopped arguing about Meadowbrook when Denise brought it up again. I told Roger, almost offhand, that I'd think seriously about the power of attorney once tax season settled down, knowing full well tax season would settle down long after anything in this story had already been decided without them. Denise's calls got warmer again that April, almost back to how they used to sound. And for a few days, I let myself half believe the whole thing might quietly resolve itself, that maybe backing them into a corner had been enough to end it. Then Roger's lawyer sent a letter to my house, dated April 22nd, laying out a proposed timeline for what he called a voluntary competency evaluation, with a suggested date scheduled for the second week of May, less than 3 weeks out, worded gently enough that a person skimming it might have mistaken it for a courtesy instead of a countdown. That letter is the reason everything with Patricia moved as fast as it did that spring. 3 weeks isn't much time to finish restructuring a $4 million estate. But it turned out to be enough, because by then, most of the real work, the trust, Emma's staged distributions, the independent trustee, was already built. What was left was making sure Dr. Okafor's assessment was dated after theirs would have been, not before, so that if it ever came down to comparing two competing medical opinions in front of a judge, mine would be the more recent, more thorough, and more credible of the two. They stopped after that. Not because they'd changed, because they realized pushing further risked exposing exactly how hard they'd been pushing. The calls didn't come back, though. Not really. Denise still called, but different now, careful, distant, like she was managing me instead of talking to me. I let her manage me. I let her think she'd simply backed off out of respect. I never told her what I'd actually done, because some things are better left unsaid until I'm gone. And by then, that sentence had stopped being a warning to my daughter and started being a promise to myself. Patricia told me something else that spring that stuck with me longer than almost anything else in this whole ordeal. She said the widow out past Idalou, the one whose son had gotten that temporary guardianship order pushed through on a thin medical opinion, eventually got her independence back. But by the time it was resolved, her son had already sold 2 parcels of her land to cover what he called necessary expenses during the guardianship period, Expenses a judge later found were mostly his own. She never fully recovered those parcels. She recovered her name, her freedom, her right to sign her own checks again. But not the land, because land sold to a third party. In good faith is a different fight entirely than land simply retitled inside a family. I thought about that woman more than I let on to Patricia, because I understood, hearing her story, exactly how much worse mine could have gotten if I hadn't moved when I did, quietly, before anyone had the standing to sell so much as an acre out from under me. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I've asked it of myself more nights than I can count this past year. When does protecting the people you love the right way stop looking any different, from the outside, than punishing the people who hurt you? I still don't have a clean answer. I only have the choice I made, and the reasons I made it. And Emma's face across that kitchen table. Emma noticed something was different that spring, though she couldn't have told you what. She mentioned it to me once, the last Thursday in April, sitting at the kitchen table in her scrubs, asking why I'd started keeping a folder of paperwork in the truck instead of the house. Why Earl had started coming by twice a week instead of once. Why I'd started talking, in small offhand ways, about things I wanted her to remember about the land, the name of the creek that ran along the south fence, the story of how her great-great-grandfather had bought that first mule team on credit he didn't pay off until he was 60. I told her I was just getting sentimental in my old age. She didn't fully believe me. She wrote in her notebook, months later, that some part of her had known, without knowing how she knew it, that I was preparing her for something. Though she assumed at the time it was simply my own mortality catching up to me in an ordinary way, not the specific shape it actually took 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning in my own kitchen. This past May, my heart did the thing my doctor had warned me about for years and never quite got around to fixing. A blockage nobody caught in time, on a Tuesday morning, alone in my kitchen, the same kitchen Loretta rolled her pie dough on, the same table Emma sat at every Thursday in her scrubs. Earl found me 2 hours later because Earl always came by on Tuesdays to check the north pump, and Earl is the one who called the ambulance, and Earl is the one who rode in the back of it holding my hand, even though there was, by then, nothing left in that hand to hold on to in any way that mattered. I am telling you this story from a place none of you can see, in a manner none of you can fully explain, because the version of Victor Alderman who's narrating this to you now is the version that exists only in the letter I left behind, read aloud in Patricia Delgado's conference room on Broadway Street on a Friday morning in June, 3 weeks after my funeral at First Baptist on 50th Street. The same fellowship hall where Roger once asked me gently what I planned to do with the house now that it was just me. The funeral itself drew close to 200 people, more than I would have guessed. Farmers and ranchers and men from the co-op on Avenue Q who'd known my father before they knew me. Earl standing at the front, the entire service in a suit Patricia later told me he'd bought new for the occasion, because he didn't own one that still fit. Denise gave the eulogy. She talked about the tractor, about Sunday dinners, about a man who never once raised his voice in 47 years, and not once, standing at that podium, did she mention the appraisal or the power of attorney or the doctor she'd scheduled behind my back, because she still believed, that day, that none of it had ever amounted to anything real. Men from the co-op on Avenue Q lined up afterward to shake Denise's hand, telling her what a fine man her father had been, how he'd loaned out equipment to half the county without ever once asking for it back on any particular schedule, how he'd carried old man Petrosky's whole harvest in on his own combine the year Petrosky's hip gave out, and never mentioned it to a soul until Petrosky himself brought it up at a funeral of his own years later. Denise stood there accepting all of it, gracious, composed, still believing the version of her father that fit neatly inside a eulogy, not yet knowing that the same man being praised for quiet generosity towards strangers had spent the final year of his life building something sent as quiet and considerably more deliberate for the one person in his own family who'd never stopped showing up. 3 weeks later, in Patricia's conference room on Broadway Street, the blinds half drawn against the June sun, a pitcher of water sweating on the table that nobody touched. Denise sat on one side of the table, Roger beside her. Thomas flew in from Denver the night before, still jet-lagged, still confused about why he'd been asked to come in person instead of hearing this over the phone. Emma sat at the far end, 19 years old, in scrubs again because she'd come straight from a clinical shift, not yet knowing this room held anything to do with her at all. Patricia read the trust documents first, plainly, without commentary. I watched Denise's face change in the accounts Patricia gave me afterward, from confusion to disbelief to something that had no clean name, somewhere between grief and fury and a kind of shame she wouldn't be able to look directly at for a long time. $4.1 million in land and mineral rights, moved out of her reach 2 years before her own father's heart gave out in a kitchen she had visited perhaps 4 times that final year. Then Patricia read the letter. My letter. Written the same week, Doctor. Okafor signed his assessment. Sealed, dated, notarized, meant for exactly this room and exactly this moment. Denise, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone. And I'm sorry for that. And I'm sorry too for the way you're hearing the rest of it. I want you to know I loved you the whole time, even while I was doing this, especially while I was doing this. You asked me once what I meant when I said some things are better left unsaid until I'm gone, and you laughed a little when I said it, and I let you laugh, because the truth underneath that sentence was too heavy to hand you while I was still standing in your kitchen, and you were still planning what to do with a house you thought was already halfway yours. I watched you and Roger request an appraisal on land my grandfather broke out of raw dirt with a mule team, without so much as telling me it was happening. I watched a doctor's appointment get scheduled behind my back, built to make me smaller than I actually was, so that somebody else could make decisions I was still perfectly capable of making myself. I don't believe you started out cruel, Denise. I believe you got scared, and scared people reach for control, and control dressed up as love is still control. I built this trust for Emma because she is the only one of you who kept showing up without being asked what it might cost her to do it. I left you enough to know I never stopped being your father. I did not leave you the land, because the land was never really what you wanted. You wanted the version of the future the land represented, and that future was never yours to plan around while I was still breathing in it. Roger's reaction, Patricia told me, came fastest and burned out fastest too. He asked, before the letter was even finished being read, whether the trust could be contested. Patricia told him plainly that Dr. Okafor's notarized capacity assessment, dated the same month the trust was signed, made a contest extremely unlikely to succeed, and that pursuing one in court would put the entire pattern of the appraisal, the power of attorney attempts, and the scheduled evaluation on public record for a judge to read line by line. Roger went quiet after that. He didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting. Patricia read one more paragraph after that, addressed not to Denise but to Emma directly, and Patricia told me Emma sat perfectly still through the entire thing, hands folded in her lap, the way she used to sit at my kitchen table waiting for pie to cool. Emma, you never once asked me what I was planning, and I think you should know that not asking was its own kind of gift, because it meant every Thursday you spent at that kitchen table was just a granddaughter spending time with her grandfather. Nothing owed, nothing expected, nothing traded. This land is yours in stages because I wanted you to build a life first, on your own terms, before 640 acres became the biggest thing anyone ever handed you. Use the trust for school, for a first car that isn't held together with a coat hanger the way mine was at your age, for whatever your life actually needs instead of whatever somebody else decides it should look like. Keep Earl close. He'll tell you the truth about me long after I can't. And when you're 35 and the last piece of this finally comes to you outright, I hope you're too busy living an actual life to need it very badly at all. Patricia told me later, in the one conversation we had after all this was finished, that Denise did not scream. Denise did not storm out. Denise sat very still for a long time. And then she asked, in a voice Patricia said she'd remember for years, whether her father had hated her at the end. Patricia told her no. Patricia told her the trust structure, the staged releases, the language in the letter. Every choice I made was the opposite of hatred. It was a man trying to protect the one person still acting like family, while quietly, carefully, refusing to be cruel to the ones who weren't. I can't tell you Denise and Roger's marriage survived the year that followed cleanly, because it didn't, not entirely, though it also didn't collapse the way you might expect from a story like this one. Roger's development off Slide Road stalled that same summer when a lending partner pulled out over unrelated financing troubles, and without the anticipated windfall from my land to cushion it. The two of them spent most of that year in a version of financial strain they'd never had to face before. I'm told, secondhand, through Emma, that it humbled something in both of them, slowly, unevenly, the way real change usually happens instead of the way it happens in the stories people like to tell about revenge. Denise sold the house on Milwaukee Avenue that November and moved into something smaller, off Frankfurt Avenue, closer to Emma's dorm than the old place had ever been. Emma told me later, through the only channel left for her to tell me anything, a notebook she started keeping the week after the funeral, that her mother came to that first Thanksgiving without Denise, at Emma's own apartment this time. Small, just the two of them, and a rotisserie chicken because neither of them wanted to cook a full bird for two people. Denise cried at that table, Emma wrote. Not the performative kind of crying, the kind that comes out sideways in the middle of an ordinary sentence about mashed potatoes. She told Emma she'd spent that whole year rereading the letter, trying to find the version of herself in it that she recognized, and mostly failing, and that failing to recognize herself was its own kind of grief she hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. I don't know if that counts as change. Patricia tells me, in the 2 updates a year her firm sends to check on the trust's administration, that Denise has not once tried to challenge the structure, has not once asked Emma to share early, has in fact started asking Emma small, ordinary questions about school and clinicals, the way a mother asks a daughter she's trying to know again for the first time. That's not forgiveness. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one too often reach for an ending that feels cleaner than the one people actually get. Denise didn't get the land back by becoming a better person. She simply became a slightly different person, in a year that cost her more than she expected, in ways that had nothing to do with me forgiving her and everything to do with her own reckoning. Done mostly alone, mostly quiet, mostly out of my sight, the same way most of what happened in her marriage that year happened out of mine. Thomas took it harder than I expected. He'd been the distant one, the Christmas and Easter one, and something about hearing that letter read aloud cracked a version of guilt in him he hadn't let himself feel in years. He started calling Emma every week after that. Not me, obviously. There was no more me to call. But he started showing up in her life the way he hadn't shown up in mine, driving down from Denver twice that fall, once just to sit with her at Covenant during a hard rotation, no occasion required, the same way Emma used to show up for me. He drove down a third time in February, unannounced, on what would have been my 77th birthday, and sat with Emma at the cemetery off 82nd Street for almost an hour, without either of them saying much of anything, which Emma wrote in her notebook was the first time in years Thomas had shown up for something without an apology already loaded before he said hello. Emma finished her second year of nursing school in May. She turns 25 in 6 years, when the first stage of the trust releases. Patricia's firm still administers it. Earl still checks the north pump every Tuesday, out of habit more than obligation now, and he told Emma, the one time she asked him directly what her grandfather was really like at the end, that I was the same man the whole way through, quiet, stubborn, careful with the people who'd earned it, and that the version of me that made hard choices about money was the exact same version of me that used to drive 40 minutes out of my way just to bring him a plate of Loretta's cooking on a bad week. I don't know if what I did was entirely right. I think about Denise's face in that room more than I think about almost anything else from the life I no longer get to have an opinion inside of. I think about whether there was a version of this where I sat her down myself, alive, and said all of it to her directly, instead of letting a lawyer and a letter do it after I was already gone. Maybe there was. I didn't take that version. I took the quieter one, the one where nobody had to watch me say it to her face, the one where the truth arrived on its own schedule instead of mine. What I do know is this. Emma still keeps a photograph on her dorm room desk, the two of us at the kitchen table, her in scrubs, me in one of my 3 flannel shirts, taken by Earl on an ordinary Thursday nobody thought to mark as important at the time. And somewhere in a trust document on Broadway Street, 640 acres my grandfather broke out of Caliche dirt with a mule team in 1931 are waiting for her, in stages, at 25, at 30, and fully at 35, exactly the way I meant them to. Earl still drives out to the property every Tuesday, same as always, checking the north pump, checking the fence line along the creek, and every few weeks he brings Emma with him, when her schedule allows it, teaching her, slowly, the things a person needs to know to eventually run 640 acres, which irrigation lines flood first after a hard rain, which section of fence goes down every spring near the old cottonwood, how to read the sky over the caprock when a storm's building faster than the forecast admits. He told her once, standing at the edge of the north pasture, that her grandfather never wanted the land to be a burden or a weapon, just a place. The same plain patch of dirt his own grandfather broke out with a mule team, meant to be worked honestly by whoever came next and cared enough to do it right. Denise asked Emma, this past spring almost shyly, whether she'd ever consider letting her come out and see the property again, not to discuss the trust, not to ask for anything, just to see it, the way she used to as a little girl riding on the tailgate of my truck. Emma said yes. They went together in April, just the two of them, and Emma wrote afterward that her mother cried again, standing at the edge of the cotton field, and this time Emma understood exactly what the crying was for, and let her mother stand there as long as she needed to, without either of them saying much of anything at all. Some things are better left unsaid until I'm gone. I said it as a warning once, and I said it again as something closer to a wall I was building around the people I still trusted. In the end, it turned out to be neither. It turned out to be a promise, made to a granddaughter who never once asked me what I was planning, because she never once needed to. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Family Story Archives. I will see you on the next one.